Welcome everyone to Mailfuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Station 11 episode 7. It's called Goodbye My Damaged Home. So spoilers for the episode. This is a Patreon sponsored series. Thank you to Alison for picking this show. And as expected, unnumbered episode, we're back to doing a more contained flashback story. Although this one's a little bit more unique in the sense that adult Kirsten is kind of experiencing it. It's like she's reliving through her memories and seeing new parts of it, or arguably maybe like re-experiencing memories that she's repressed and doesn't like to think about for, traumatic reasons. So it's got that interesting little hook to it. Although, to be honest, that wasn't, for the most part, the thing that I was into the most in the episode. It does lead to a kind of a nice moment at the end with her. It's interesting though, because as I was watching this episode, I was thinking about I was thinking about what I liked in the airport episode and what I liked in the Miranda episode, and I think it's interesting that I think what I liked about those two different episodes were very different things. With the Miranda episode, I was very much into her character and how she was dealing with what was around her, her relationship with Arthur, how that motivated who she was, and some of the decisions she made, and kind of just uncovering who this person was that made the comic in the first place. But with the airport episode, it was kind of the opposite, where the human characters were less interesting to me, especially Tyler. But the mechanics and the idea of the society forming out of this group stranded at an airport in the post-apocalypse was what was interesting to me about that. So getting into this one, I think I was, at least early on in the episode, I was thinking, oh, maybe this won't land as well for me as the airport episode did, because it is purely about characters. It's purely about their emotions. It's purely about how they're dealing with what's going on. This tells the story pretty much of the time between Jeevan and Kirsten going to Frank's place in episode 1 and when they leave sometime, 3 months later, 2.5 months later, something like that. So that's what this story is, and it's not super surprising in that sense, where I feel like a lot of the big beats seem like they make sense. It feels like stuff that probably would have happened. It's more about the intricacies. It's about the little human moments. It's about how they're bonding or connecting. It's sharing some motifs and little thematic touches that's tying up with other stories that we've already had in the show. One that stuck out to me quite a bit was this idea of Jeevan and Frank speaking in a different language so they could speak in front of Kirsten without her knowing what they're saying. And they're not saying anything bad, but it's kind of that, in that way that grown-ups might not want to have the kid hear what they're talking about if it's something really bad. Like early on, the example is they're talking about the fact that Kirsten's just realizing that her parents are dead, so they're just debating how to approach her with that, how to coddle her, or how to parent her about it. Maybe not in those words, but that's the kind of the vibe. And that reminded me a lot of one of the main thematic sort of motifs that was in the Miranda episode, because a lot of that episode was this idea of him speaking in Spanish and her seemingly not being able to understand it, but then that was a bit murkier later on. She had seemingly learned it at some point. Did she know it all along? Was that more symbolic? Because I think what's interesting is that the second time it happens in this episode, when the two brothers are sitting speaking in a different language, Kirsten is looking backwards and forwards, and it feels like she doesn't understand the exact words they're saying, but it does seem like she kind of gets the tone of the conversation. She's being more observant. She's starting to like get the vibe of what the conversation is, and it's maybe this idea that the intention or the meaning of the characters in the scene transcends the language itself in some ways. But regardless, super interesting to notice that connection there. The other connections I was sort of getting as well was just this idea of like Jeevan effectively becoming Kirsten's spaceman, right? To sort of compare it to the story and to compare it to how Miranda had this imaginary spaceman. Kirsten kind of like has Jeevan become that, and arguably to an extent, Frank was first in that she bonded with Frank more. Jeevan didn't connect with her in quite the same way as quickly. And that's something that even maybe, I wouldn't say makes him jealous per se, but I think like, when he's talking to himself as if he's talking to his sister, and he's kind of like he's praying almost. and he mentions that Kirsten and Frank have a thing. That's the way he phrases it. They have a thing. He feels like he's not bonded with her in the same way. He feels a little bit like he's on the outside of like a inner circle almost or something. Whatever way you want to phrase it, but I, I think those little ideas, those little moments were really good. I think the music in this episode is pretty good. I haven't necessarily loved the music across the board in this show. I think sometimes tonally it's felt a little bit too upbeat for me. I do think the main theme that plays in this episode, particularly a lot towards the end, I do think hits quite hard. I think it works quite well. So, yeah, I mean, we have a few big moments to kind of talk about, but the big ideas here is building up to this play that we kind of knew about. It's kind of been hinted at before that Kirsten made the brothers put on a play of the comic book in the apartment before they leave. And that's what it's all kind of building up to. And because old Kirsten's kind of like hallucinating because of the poison in her system from the end of last episode, she's actually talking to her younger self and saying, don't do the play. Seriously, you leave one day too late. Don't do the play. But young Kirsten obviously can't heed that warning because it's not like Kirsten's actually traveling back through time. She's not really talking to her younger self. She's talking to herself in her memories in a way as a sort of a therapeutic thing, if you want to call it that. But she's not actually affecting the past. So she has to watch all these events play out. She has to see what happens when they do the play. And we see the build up to that. The main thing the brothers fight about, of course, is whether or not they should leave. Frank doesn't want to leave. Frank thinks this is home. Frank doesn't think it's safe to go outside. Jeevan thinks it's been enough time, that the flu's probably not that much of a danger anymore because too many people are dead. Whatever. And they debate over this and go through kind of the motions of that. And we see a lot of the early day struggles of like being in Chicago when this all goes down. Towards the end of the episode, they literally have it's like a can of beans that's been frozen. So it's just like this lump of beans sitting in a bowl, which I'm not even sure if they're going to try and like thaw out a little bit before they eat it, or if that's just how they're having to eat food because there's not really many other options. But yeah, it really sells kind of the lower stakes here. But it's interesting though, because in the same way that the people in the airport had to sort of build their own new society, these three characters effectively build their own little mini society. I mean, it's just an apartment, it's just three people, but they have to do this, right? They have to go, they have to form new relationships, they have to find moments of levity, find moments where they can ease up. And there are moments like that. There's a moment where Frank says he's got something important to show them, and it's like this tape, but it basically just makes a beat and then he starts rapping over it. I'm sure it's a famous song that I just don't know, but I don't know the song. But he starts rapping and the others who get into it, and Kirsten gets Jeevan up dancing. And it's this kind of upbeat moment of like hope and of like, hey, they're kind of forming this family unit. There's even points where Jeevan says, hey, we've got a kid now. And he almost sounds like he's talking to a partner about having a child, which obviously that's not the scenario we're in, but effectively these two have become parents. So I think one of the big scenes, though, that leads into the ending directly is this idea that at one point Kirsten asks Jeevan what he would do if he knew that the virus was coming, that the epidemic was coming. And he's not really sure, but he's like, oh, maybe go and come here earlier, see my sister, whatever. And Kirsten says, oh, I'd probably say goodbye to Arthur. I didn't get to say goodbye to him. In fact, I didn't get to say goodbye to anyone. And Jeevan responds with, why don't you say goodbye now? And he's kind of like just flippant about it. Like he's like, well, just say goodbye now. To him, that's just the normal thing to do, is say goodbye after the fact. And this was the other thing that tied back to a previous episode. This idea of like saying goodbye to someone who's already dead. It made me think of the stuff in the airport with Tyler having all the kids talk to their dead loved ones over the radio. It was making me think of that a little bit. So some of these like key theme ideas are kind of creeping back in through the episodes. And Kirsten seemingly doesn't do it, but she does at the very end of the episode. The adult version of Kirsten, who stayed back in the apartment with the dead Frank, which we'll get to his death in a minute, but she stays back and the episode ends with her saying goodbye, Frank. And it's this idea that this repressed part of her childhood that she's kind of, maybe not, forgotten all of it. I'm not saying she's forgotten all of this happened, but she has repressed it and doesn't want to think about it, hasn't made peace with it, certainly. And this moment at the end is her sort of taking Jeevan's advice and actually saying goodbye as an adult. And the idea that it's taken her that long to kind of like understand the benefit of doing that now, to finally sort of let that go. So, like, I think these are pretty smart little storytelling techniques. They are. I think it's a pretty solid episode. I don't know if I liked it quite as much as either the Miranda or Airport episode, and I think I'm in the minority there. I think most people probably loved this episode when it aired through the season, and I don't know if it's a sort of thing where part of it's a bit later in the season for me. Part of it might be the I don't know. I honestly, I think adult Kirsten being there, even though the ending with her finally saying goodbye to Frank, something that she's not done in like 20 years, as much as that's actually one of the best little touches the episode has of like feeling like it really ties everything together, I think adult Kirsten being around is one of the weird things about it that I think made me not completely love it, right? I think there's a lot of effective scenes in here, and especially when I stop and think about how some of the themes tie into previous episodes, I think there's a lot of good little things going on. And the performances are very good as well. I think young Kirsten is incredibly talented. I think she like brings this energy to her scenes of this kind of innocence, but like kind of hopefulness at times. Even obviously sometimes she's sad, but when she's being more hopeful and she's sort of that's bouncing off Jeevan be completely kind of like pessimistic, them as a pair actually works quite well, and Frank too kind of mixed in there. But she sort of like complements being around him so well that it's actually kind of a shame, and it really points out to me how little older Kirsten has that in her episodes. Like, because I don't know if I felt that with her with any character, and I get that from a logical point of view that she would be more closed off because of all these experiences. She's very hesitant to kind of be the same way and sort of attach herself to people as quickly, and likewise also take really strong care of the people she has attached herself to. But it is kind of a jarring thing to me where I don't think I've quite connected with any of the characters in the present day future stuff as much as I do in the characters in the backstories. But that's not to take away anything from this episode, because I do think that some of the best scenes of the show are in this episode. Some of the more emotional moments of the show are in this episode. It definitely treats it with as a very interesting tone that's, because it could very easily play this a little bit more melodramatic. It could very easily play this a little bit more like, I don't know, like more heart-wrenching scenes, but it kind of treats it in this way, which I think is meant to mimic how Kirsten thinks about these events, where she's tried to detach herself from them. So it's trying to play this idea of it being at an arm's distance. Even the fact that young Kirsten goes and hides when everything's going down, which... So, yeah, a stranger comes into the apartment, and that happens because a few days earlier, Jeevan opened the door because one of Frank's points when they were debating about going outside is that, oh, you don't have any data. We can only look out through the east window. We can't even see the other side of the city to see what's going on. So Jeevan opens the door, which they've got kind of barricaded and tape around it and all that, and he goes into the apartment across the hall. And it's, completely frozen over. The windows are broken, so it's got snow and everything. He finds like a radio and stuff, and a nice big grand piano and all sorts of things. And it's, it's whatever, right? But him doing that means that the door's not barricaded anymore. And sure enough, when they're doing the play a couple of days later, which Kirsten's kind of, been begging them to do, and Frank agrees to do it, this attacker comes in and says he's taking this place, and he's holding a knife in his hand, and this ends up being the knife that Kirsten has, because Kirsten takes this with her before the end of the story. But Frank says no. Jeevan's like, yeah, you know what, we're packed, we're ready to go, you can take the place, we're just going to leave anyway. But Frank doesn't want to do that. He says he's home, so this guy jumps forward and stabs him, and then Jeevan has to fight this guy to the death, which, somewhat happens off camera. We see them struggling and whatnot, but we kind of stick with young Kirsten when she leaves the scene, and Although older Kirsten sees a little bit more of it and gets to see more of it play out, and sort of how Jeevan effectively strangles him and whatever. But this is how Frank dies. And the irony that the scene that they were doing for the play was the death scene of Frank's character. He was playing, uh, the doctor or whoever on the on the station in the book. Honestly, one of the most interesting things that I think they could do at this point is just let us read the goddamn comic. So I can know what all these references are to all these various things. Obviously, we know there's an undersea character and this is the character who kills Frank's character. And then, like, in the book, apparently, because Jeevan asks Kirsten what happens next, and she's like, oh, the undersea leader and 11 are together for a while. And it's like, okay, so it feels like things are more and more mirroring the story more directly. So we'll see maybe what comes of that thematically. But some interesting little details here is that, Jeevan starts talking to himself, and Kirsten notices this, and adult Kirsten says, oh, I thought that happened, that started at the cabin. And young Kirsten says, no, it started here. And also, what's the cabin? which was an amusing little line. But it's like, okay, so we're learning more about this idea that, whatever Jeevan's got going on, like, is something that was already building at this point. But you've got that, and you've also got the idea that Frank doesn't want to go with them because Frank thinks that Jeevan has to take care of both of them, and that he'll fail to do so. But he needs to make sure that Kirsten will be okay. So he basically says that, no, the only way that I can ensure both of you stay okay is if I don't go. Like, you need to take care of her, and you can't take care of me at the same time. And it's like, it's a very, it sounds like he's making a bit of a self-sacrifice. Part of me also wonders, like, because when the episode starts, we find out that Frank's got a heroin addiction, and it's something that he flushes away just before Jeevan comes over. Like, he finds out he's on his way and gets rid of it. And we hear his backstory as well, which I guess is the other thing we need to talk about here, is that he is a ghostwriter, but he wasn't always a ghostwriter. He was once a journalist, and he was in a bombing in Sri Lanka, and that's why he's got the injury that he has with his hip. And he tells this to Kirsten, and Kirsten talks about having a brother that died before she was born, and they talk about what ifs and all that. But, Frank opens up a little bit about who his character is, and we learn that Jeevan flew all the way to go get him, and he was there in the hospital when Frank woke up. And it's kind of a sweet story of their bond, of like how close they are, and it really paints a picture of who Frank is. There's also a sweet scene where this seems to be the morning after, like the first morning after Kirsten's got there, and things have just started to really change. And Kirsten's looking out over the city at the window, and Frank comes out and says that he loves this view. The first time he moved in here, he saw the sunrise, and he's like, oh yeah, it's an east-facing window. And that actually ends up tying in. I mean, it's a nice little scene because he's basically reassuring Kirsten that while Jeevan's a bit weird at times and he's got his problems, they're safe, right? He's kind of assuring her, we're not a pair of like killers or anything like that. You're safe with us. He's trying to reassure, which is a nice little character trait as well. But it ties in later, this east thing, because he gives her a compass that's broken. It's the compass he had on him when he got hurt. And it's broken so that it always points east, right? It'll always tell you you're heading east no matter where you are or where you're pointing it. And when they leave at the end, when Jeevan and Kirsten leave at the end, they go east. They go the way that Frank liked looking out the window. So there's kind of that as well running through the episode of like kind of in some way honoring, like going the way he liked to look is a kind of that. There's a lot of really smart writing touches throughout the episode. And building Frank as a character, which neatly complements also building Jeevan as a character by learning more about him. Because keep in mind, like this is, other than a few scenes of the cabin stuff and like one of the future episodes where we got a couple of little flashbacks, by and large, this is the first time we're really seeing a lot of Jeevan again since that first episode, and even young Kirsten to an extent. So it's kind of like a big deal to return to these characters. It's very much like, obviously I don't know if it would have the same emotional impact if you followed it up right after episode 1, but you could almost watch episode 1 and go straight into this one as like a twofer and just kind of like get a story. It would feel kind of weird, right? I think ending this with effectively them leaving again, but barring the little thing with adult Kirsten, it would feel really strange to do that in episode 2 right? It works revisiting that moment again because we're coming back 6 episodes later. We've had some time passing, and now we have a lot more context for where this story's going to go, who these characters are, and everything else. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a good episode. It's emotional at times. I think the music's really good. I think the performances are pretty much fantastic throughout. But I have a weird vibe with it, and I think part of it is just because I already know that it doesn't do anything to improve what I am going back to next episode, right? Everything with the troop at the airport seemingly captured, whatever we're going to find out what the people at the airport have turned into over time, or how they've changed, if they've become really bad people or whatever. Everything with Tyler being the prophet and all his stuff. Like, all of that stuff I don't really care about or like that much. So honestly, the biggest like shadow over this episode is that I know I have to go back to that, and nothing in this episode has made any of that better necessarily. And I'm sure maybe in hindsight, I'll be able to look at it and say thematically I was set up for certain things because of how we've revisited more of Kirsten's story here. But nothing in this episode has made me excited to get back to that. And it kind of leaves me in this weird place where I'm like, I'm not even sure what I'm excited about next in terms of the story, because now that we've filled in this key gap in Kirsten and Jeevan's relationship, I'm like, well, what's the next thing that I'm going to really attach to? Because I guess it's probably the rest of Kirsten and Jeevan's story, right? Them out of the cabin, them finding that place, if we even get that story. Maybe what happened to Jeevan, right? That's by far the thing I'm the most interested in the rest of the story. All this stuff in the future with adult Kirsten and Tyler, not as much. So it's kind of weird to come out of this really, really well done episode, but also have very little interest in where we're going back to next time. So very, very strange feeling as a show. So I am hoping that before we get to the end of the season and the show itself, because it is only one season, I'm hoping that somehow it can turn that stuff in the future around to feel like an essential thing that ties into all of these different flashback stories. But I do acknowledge that I don't know how you would end this if it was just all these flashback stories. Like, if you just gave me a show that was episode 1, episode 3, episode 5, and episode 7, like, what would be the ending we're building up to without all that stuff in the future? That is obviously something that would be a problem, and I don't know what it is. But I'm a little concerned that future stuff that I'm not feeling anywhere closely as much is the one that's going to have to end the story. That's the one that's going to have to bring it all together. So that's kind of a weird feeling at this point. I don't know if I've ever watched a show before where it's such a pattern. It's such a one good episode, one episode I don't like that much. One good episode, one episode I don't like that much. I don't think I've ever watched a show that has that. Maybe there's some shows that have kind of happened to have fallen into that for a few episodes, just by happenstance, but not ones that are consistent and you can expect it going forward. You can only sort of realize it when you look back after the fact. So I really hope episode 8 does something for me. I hope episode 8 can make the future stuff be more compelling and feel like we're paying off some of the things that we've been building up to and can draw me in. But I don't know if that ship has sailed or not. It just kind of depends. It depends on what they do with it and how they continue doing the flashback stories. I really don't know. I really don't know. I'm curious. I'll say that much, but I don't know. So anyway, that's my thoughts on this episode of Station 11, if I can remember the title. Let me know what you thought of this one in the comments. Like, subscribe, all that stuff. Helps out a bunch if you do. And of course, you can support all the content over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and get some bonuses for your troubles. But thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?